Okay, everyone, I think we're going to get started despite our technical challenges. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm Eli Karetny, Interim Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. On behalf of CUNY, the Graduate Center, the PhD programs in History and Political Science, and the Ralph Bunche Institute, I'd like to welcome Laura Field, who will be in conversation with Richard Wolin about her new book, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. Richard Wolin, as many of you know, is a distinguished professor of history and political science here at GC. He is an intellectual historian who writes on 20th century European philosophy and ideology, and has authored numerous books and articles which explore the thought and influence of, among others, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, the Frankfurt School, Carl Schmitt, and Martin Heidegger. Laura Field, our guest of honor this evening, is a writer, political theorist, and expert on American far-right populist intellectualism. Her research has been published in the Journal of Politics, the Review of Politics, and Polity. She has also written for The Bulwark, The New Republic, and Politico. She received her PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin and has held faculty positions at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, Georgetown, and American University. She is currently a scholar in residence at American University, a senior advisor for the Illiberalism Studies program at George Washington University, and a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institute. A word about Laura's fantastic and insightful new book on the intellectual influences that shaped the MAGA New Right. This book really hit home for me. I wrote my dissertation on Leo Strauss and have an intimate sense of how Strauss's thought. Seductive was a Richard Wolin term in regards to Nietzsche's work, and I think that applies to Strauss as well. Seduction can be a dangerous affair, especially for young, impressionable minds. So many quotes to choose from. I've selected one that for me was especially penetrating. I quote, "It is hard not to speculate about what Nietzsche would have thought of these 21st century men and aspiring Übermenschen. My sense is that he would diagnose them straightforwardly as late modern decadents under the sway of vengeful Pauline morality and aesthetics, desperate for meaning, lashing out in anger and resentment, small-souled and sterile." That's good stuff. Come for the crisis of masculinity. Stick around for when Laura plays the part of Athena, saving the American Republic by challenging liberals to be smarter, better, stronger, especially in the realm of ideas. This evening, Laura will share some thoughts about her personal journey from Straussian academic circles to critic of the New Right as she discusses her wonderful new book. Afterwards, Richard will engage Laura in a conversation about key ideas in the book, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Richard, floor is yours.
Thank you, Eli. Thanks to all of you for showing up on this wintry New York afternoon. And thanks especially to Laura for agreeing for you to join us today. I have a feeling that in the last 4 weeks, and it's exactly 4 weeks since the book was released, Furious Minds, she's had a very busy time of it, which is exactly how it should be. So without further ado, except for acknowledging the assistance of the Ralph Bunche Institute, Eli Karetny, John Torpey, Director, let me turn the floor over to Laura for some introductory remarks, and then we'll have a discussion.
Thank you. I'm just going to move this back a little bit so that it's not blocking people over there. It's okay. Is that all right? Thank you for having me. I'm so delighted to be in New York. It's very nice to get away from DC right now, and New York is the best place. So thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you, Richard, for inviting me. Richard read some crucial chapters and really helped me while I was writing this book because he knows so much about just certain dimensions of the things I was writing about. So I'm really grateful to you. Thank you, Eli. It's really nice to be here. So I will say, as Eli mentioned, I'm going to say a little bit about my background, a little bit about what I'm calling the MAGA New Right, and then I'll just say a little bit about what I was trying to do with the book. So How is it that I ended up being the one writing this kind of strange book for our strange moment? The short version is that I fell in love with political philosophy when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Alberta with some Straussians. You probably have heard of the Straussians, and we'll have opportunity to say more about that, I'm sure. So these were the people I studied with at the University of Alberta, were wonderful professors, sort of great teachers of the great books and the great questions. And then I went to study, I just got totally hooked on it. I went on to study in conservative academic circles for my graduate work at the University of Texas. But I was never really much of a conservative myself, and I was not especially political either. I was, I love political philosophy and Plato and Rousseau and Hobbes and all of this, but I was not engaged in politics. I wasn't very political person. And just to give you a sense of this, I wrote my dissertation on the autobiographical writings of Rousseau and Nietzsche. I mean, I talked about the political implications of that, but I was not especially, that made it, the job market for political theory is always bad. And when you write about autobiography, it's weird. So anyway, that's my sort of tendency. But if you fast forward to 2016 and 2017, I was maybe more political by then than I had been, and I was sort of scandalized by Trump's win, and then slightly more scandalized by the fact that people in adjacent academic circles were some of the first to defend Trump from an intellectualized perspective. So I'm thinking especially of Michael Anton of the Claremont Institute, who wrote this famous essay, The Flight 93 Election. And I wasn't even aware of that when it was happening. And it got read by Rush Limbaugh on his program. So millions of people heard this in September 2016. And I didn't know about that, but then found out subsequently. And I thought, oh my God, that's pretty close to home in a way. And so I started paying much more attention. I started watching pretty closely. And then the next thing, then Patrick Deneen's kind of getting in on this game and in a different way at the University of Notre Dame. And so it kind of grew. And at the time, I was already kind of itching to do more writing and more public-facing writing. So I thought, well, this is something I have some things to say about. So that's when I started writing about them. And then honestly, after January 6th, I thought that this would die down. I thought the movement would kind of take the exit ramp, think, okay, that didn't go very well after January 6th, but that's not what happened. They stayed in the game. Trump stayed in. They built a lot of momentum. They sort of took over the GOP institutions in some important ways. And so that's when it started to make sense to write the book version. So that's a little bit about me. I'd say I was scandalized. I would also say it wasn't a complete surprise to see. I continue to be alarmed and not alarmed by what's happening. And I start the book with this anecdote from a scene at a conservative, what I call like a conservative summer camp, right? Where they have there are a lot of different sort of adjacent conservative organizations adjacent to universities and standing independently, where you can go study the founding with different scholars, and you can come together with young conservatives. And I did one of those at the University of Virginia in 2010. And so the book starts with this anecdote of a man who, a staffer high up in the organization who ran this program, saying this really, offensive line about Michelle Obama at the first dinner of the night. And I was repulsed by that. And that's when I sort of thought, I got to get out of this. What am I doing here? And so that's where I started the book. So, I mean, I was disillusioned with a lot of that conservative intellectual world before I started writing the book. And I think my situation as someone who was never loyal to the conservative movement and not especially loyal to the Straussians I was with, as we can discuss, allowed me to kind of write this book. But I was also kind of, one of the reviewers has said that I was casting out my demons, by writing this book, and there's probably some truth to that. So that's a little bit about me. I think that just in practical terms, to say a little bit about why this group matters, what the group I call the MAGA New Right. It's, let me just say a little bit about who I'm talking about here. The term MAGA New Right, I use it to describe the network of clusters of thinkers, intellectuals, and activists who have come to define Trumpism. So they're providing intellectual infrastructure. There we go. We're all set. That's all we need.
Oh, just make the camera big.
I think it was a conspiracy. Convinced of that.
All right, there we go. Okay. So they provide intellectual art infrastructure to Trump and the administration, policy support, and culture war energy. I think from a sort of more concrete standpoint, we can see them in the fact they wrote, this one fellow with the Claremont Institute, John Eastman, wrote the clue memos for January 6th. They've taken over and consolidated power with key conservative institutions like the Heritage Foundation, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and there's a whole proliferation of new institutions also connected to this movement and media platforms that sort of just generating a whole new kind of energy on the right. They're generating policy proposals, not just for things like Project 2025, but also in red states all over the country. During the Biden administration, they were doing these test balloons, the takeover of the college campuses, New College in Florida, that sort of thing. They are the real force behind JD Vance. He's their darling, so that was a major win for them. And then, as I mentioned already, the kind of cultural takeover of the GOP and the sort of youthful energy that's often really disgusting, that's gaining more and more influence. So in Furious Minds, I chronicle the coalescence and consolidation of the movement between 2016 and 2024, and really just the intellectual side of it. The book proceeds according to a loose chronology, dipping back into the past when necessary to explain some of the precursors to Trumpism, but mainly it's very presentist. I also move thematically in various chapters, trying to treat the different factions of the MAGA New Right in their own separate realms, while also showing how they merge and overlap. So to just say a little bit about the substance of what they stand for, an easy shorthand is that they are, relative to the old GOP, they've kind of gone left on economics and right on culture, and I think that that's useful. But I think sort of a broader definition would be to say that as an ideological matter, the MAGA New Right stands for a rejection of the universalist, rights-based liberal order and internationalism, and its replacement with socially conservative nativist populism and transactional realism abroad. In 2016, and this is, I'll try my best to get the chart up. Michael Anton, who I've already mentioned, had offered a definition of Trumpism that I think is really useful and is usefully contrasted with the old sort of establishment republicanism of Ronald Reagan, which is often described as fusionism, and the idea of the Gipper's stool, so free market economics, social conservatism, and anti-communism abroad, or liberal internationalism. Is there some way to make this? Well, that's big enough, I guess. Can you all see that? All right. And so Anton defined the New Right, and again, this is defining Trumpism in 2016 as nationalist economics, secure borders, and an America First foreign policy. And I think obviously social conservatism is still there, so that's how I'm defining the MAGA New Right stool in terms of just the basic analytic. And so you could see the contrast there. I think that holds up pretty well. And Anton saw that really clearly in 2016, that Trump stood for something that's been part of the conservative movement for a long time. I mean, he didn't invent that stuff, right? That was already there in sort of paleoconservatism, what they call the old right, sort of from the early part of the 20th century. And I think it captures the shift. It's not to say that the shift is complete or that that's all there is, but I think it's a useful definition. So what I'm trying to do in the book is a few different things. I wanted to give just an explanation of what happened, right? I wanted to profile the key figures involved, give an explainer of how it all unfolded with the key moments, important people, and explain the ideas that they stand for. There are these different parts of the movement, and I wanted to explain how the different pieces fit together. Here's the next slide and we'll just leave this up there for the remainder of the talk. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail about this right now, but the book, that's from like page 20 of the book. And that's basically the people who are involved in the different groups that I identify, which are the National Conservatives as the big umbrella group, the post-liberals, who are the Catholic conservatives, the Claremonters, whom I've already mentioned, and then the sort of hard right fascist underbelly, who Richard is an expert on. So that's my categorization, and that was the most important part of the book is just to provide that explainer of what happened, how it happened, what they believe, and who they are. I also, though, wanted to convey this seductive quality, right? This thing that Richard's already mentioned and Eli also, to convey something about what makes this so alluring, why it's not just a bunch of fascist jokers, though there is plenty of that, and they're not just all sort of LARPing online. But there's something serious here, something sort of deadly dangerous and something to be really worried about. And so, but that's also not just something that can be written off and made fun of. I use the book to kind of show how I use some personal stuff in the book to talk a little bit about how I got drawn into conservative thought, but I wasn't even drawn to conservative thought. I was drawn to Nietzsche, right? I was drawn to Plato, and I still am. I don't repudiate that, and I think it's important. I mean, I'm still very much, maybe more than you, drawn to Nietzsche and in a genuine way. So I talk in the book about that, and I try to show why it's so appealing. I talk in the book about how there are 3 different things that differentiate this current new right from older episodes of populism, including, Barry Goldwater, Pat Buchanan, and even the Tea Party. And I say that it's much more misogynist in an explicit way. Prior iterations were certainly anti-feminist, but I think that there's a kind of raw misogyny in this that's different. I talk about the youthfulness and sort of raw energy and the social media savvy that they seem to have exploited or they've manifested. And then I talk just about their total, the success they've had, right? That never happened to Goldwater or Buchanan. But I think there's this other thing going on too, where there's this melange of highbrow and low, right? There's this sort of stuff on Twitter with the Ubermensch and the quoting Plato and the return and and the Greco-Roman stuff, and it just goes on and on. Bronze Age pervert. There's just so much of that, and so I thought it was important to convey some of that in the book, and how that's not there are reasons for that, and what I think they're doing is really exploiting some of the vulnerabilities of liberalism in terms of meaning making, right? In terms of modern malaise, and how liberal democracy doesn't really give us answers. Its whole thing, right, is that it's not going to tell us how to live our lives, that we have individual liberty. These people are happy to tell us how to live our lives, right? They have answers for how it is to be done. So I think that a lot of what we're seeing with that mix of highbrow and low is they're sort of swooping in to fill these holes in liberalism, these sort of vulnerabilities of liberalism. So that's a big sub theme in the book that was really important to me, and there's some stuff in there, especially about higher education. So those were the 2, so the explanation, the seductive quality, trying to account for that in a serious way. And then finally, I just wanted to convey a sense of urgency about what is going on, because I think it's pretty bad. So that's what I was trying to do with the book. And I'm very delighted by the response. It's been very heartening.
Great summary and very eloquent, and a lot of potential for leading questions along the way. Why don't we start off with the Straussian dimension of all this, because to begin with, it seems very contradictory that someone who devoted his life in Germany in the 1920s and 30s to, like many others of his generation, focusing on Plato. So something that's 2,400 years in the past as a key or solution to understanding modernity. And then you have this extremely disjunction. Strauss comes to America in 39 or so. And the proliferation of various schools of Straussianism. Thank you. So there's very little that's immediately political about Strauss, but we know from another Straussian reception history or story, namely going back to the Iraq War and the DoD with its Straussians, etc., in the early 2000s, that it can be done. There can be connections made between the abstruseness of Strauss's Plato interpretation and other Greeks from the 5th and 4th centuries, we see, to contemporary American politics. Can you help us figure out how this works, how one can get from someone who in many ways was a classicist and a Platonist to the carnage we see before our eyes. And Straussians have been we'll get into this when we segue to the Claremont Institute and they're almost to almost speak the language of conspiracy theory. They are practically the string pullers of so much that's going on from the Flight 93 election, which maybe you could talk about too, because Michael Anton is all over the place here. Back in 2016, to the rationalizations and justifications for the January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol, just in the news again right now. So.
Thank you, Richard. Richard gave me his questions ahead of time, so I got some answers for you. I want to say first that I'm a little bit I'm a bad Straussian, but I also wanted to I want to defend Strauss a little bit. I don't think that there's any sort of direct causal pathway here or simple causal pathway here, and I'm a bad Straussian to the extent that I don't read a lot of Strauss and never have, and I'm sort of a Straussian in name, but they wouldn't really claim me. But I do have some things to say about this, but there's no causal pathway. And I think one thing that Strauss did, he's known for sort of the rediscovery of esotericism. He's known for thinking in terms of the ancients versus the moderns and loving ancient thought, right? And trying to restore some sort of an ancient philosophy to our world. He's known for, and that's not the only dichotomy, reason versus revelation, just this sort of these grandiose dualisms. That's sort of the language of Strauss. But he wrote in this really cagey way, and he wrote philosophical commentaries. And so Straussians, if you're a good Straussian, you read Straussian commentaries on original texts, you read commentaries on, and you try to unpack all of the layers of meaning, and it can be extremely intoxicating, and I can get into that, but it's not really my thing. I'd rather just go, I like Plato better, it's way more fun to read than Strauss, and as I've mentioned, like Nietzsche and some of these other philosophers, I really like the literary part of it. But another thing I think Strauss did, and that was really part of my experience, was he really opened up these sort of big philosophical questions in a genuine way. And with this assumption that you could read these old philosophical texts, gain an understanding of the movement of history and how ideas have shaped like all of history, which is totally intoxicating, and also perhaps give you some answers to your life. Like you can read Plato and learn about the different parts of your soul, right? And how you might learn to harness your energies in new ways or sublimate your desires. That's a very intoxicating thing too. And I think that Strauss, at least my teachers who were Straussians, really opened that up in a way that can be life-changing, right? When you encounter literature and when you encounter a teacher who opens up these worlds for you in a real way, that's not something to take lightly. And Strauss was masterful at that, and so were his students. And so, but I don't think it's unconnected to what's happening now, because part of what, so one thing I want to say is that I don't think it was Strauss. Strauss did that in a way, but he was channeling Plato and some of these great philosophers, and the questions that we have to confront now about these philosophers, these weird sophists and awful people who I write about. I mean, they're not awful, but they're not all awful, but many of them are. The problems that are identified here, Strauss was important because he identified those problems because Plato identified those problems, right? There's the problem of Alcibiades, and there's the problem of like Plato going off to Syracuse to try to teach the tyrants how to be better rulers. The relationship between philosophy and politics is like it's like the whole point of Plato in a way. So you can't disentangle that. And I think what Strauss did was allow and sort of facilitate a whole generations of Americans to be conversant in those questions and those problems, all these massive political questions about power and authority, and not just Plato, but Machiavelli too, right? And all the moderns and all of these things. Not to say that they're all knowing experts on philosophy or that they have the story straight, but he kind of opened up that world to generations of students, the world of like taking politics really seriously in a philosophical way. So I don't think the fact that he did that, he's got thousands of students by now of Straussians in the country, many of whom have been, studied at elite institutions and have had a lot of power in this country, but I don't think Strauss can be sort of targeted in a simple way for either not the Iraq stuff and not what's happening now. That said, there is a way that Strauss spoke that is and taught that just fuels a kind of cultishness, and that happened in his schools and the students who followed him. It happened where I studied. It's pretty much, I think, calculated to happen. I don't know enough about Strauss because I'm a bad Straussian to really know how much he intended that to happen. But I think a lot of these teachers do. They treat you like you're part of an elite initiation process. They're going to give you the secret goods, right? They're going to take you on a journey through these books, and you're part of the elect. And so once you're in, you feel empowered by that. And it's not just that they're telling you this, it's that you're experiencing it by reading these amazing texts and seeing these secret teachings. And it's not just, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but if you spend a lot of time reading Plato, that's there. The esotericism thing isn't just a joke. It's like a magical part of the literature. It's like if you know Mahler's symphonies, there's programs in there, right? A wonderful genius is going to write with a whole bunch of delicacy and complexity, and but that has a certain impact, and it's quite overcharged in these circles, and it has a sort of impact psychologically on then generation after generation. So the esotericism, I think, invites a kind of addiction to this sense of superiority against the people around you, and that's really powerful thing. And this sort of what Nietzsche calls the pathos of distance, right, where you just feel above everything. And it's really transgressive. And I think that, so if we're just talking cheaply, you're talking about transgressive ideas. It feels transgressive. And then there's also just, you're studying a lot of thinkers, that some of them with fascistic tendencies. And what could be more fascistic than transgression? Or what could be more transgressive than fascism, right? So that was there as part of my education from a young age, just these weird conversations you'd have about Nietzsche and what might be necessary to, have greatness again. So I think that's psychologically kind of how it works with the Straussians. And then the dichotomies, when we think about the ancients versus the moderns, or reason versus revelation, Straussians, that's what they talk about. That's where they think the secret teachings are about. Like that's what you're always talking about if you're really into this stuff. And I think in the long run, there's not much room there for pluralism of morality, right? Of like, well, what about somebody who's not a true believer of any which kind? There's a part where I really do blame Strauss for a kind of postmodernists would just say that the dualisms, the constant reemphasizing of these binaries. It's just I think that mode of thinking can really lend itself to authoritarianism in thought more generally. So I do blame him for that. So that's the sort of answer for Straussianism generally. And then we could talk about the Claremont Institute but I don't know how much detail. I've gone on quite a while with that one. So
well, I think it's interesting, and we're at a graduate center where ideas are supposed to matter. I think it's not just stratospheric and irrelevant. And when you think about the proto-fascistic aspects of the Republic, especially the myth of the metals and the cave allegory in part, and the disparagement of the hoi polloi.
Yeah.
Plato was not a great Democrat, if anything. Obviously, the opposite he held.
Well, I don't think that's even true. I think that's just what the Straussians tend to see and emphasize. I think Plato's got a tremendous liberal streak, right, as well, in the sort of sensibility of it, and in, when you get into it deeply, right, it's not so simple, but that's not what the Straussians emphasize.
Right.
Yeah.
They emphasize the spirited part of the soul, tumos, a lot, and you see this in the obsessive testosterone fueled masculinism, and the flip side of that is which is characteristic throughout the MAGA movement.
Yeah.
Despair. You began talking about this. We can't understand this Michael Anton diatribe from 2016, the Flight 93 election. I mean, you put it very well in the book, the horror of horrors, having a woman as president. We already had an African-American president, right? Just we thought it couldn't get any worse. A woman?
Yeah.
I mean, it took me a while to correlate the hysteria. This really is this, and the solution to the problematic of the Flight 93 is to vote for Donald Trump. And of course, those like me who couldn't take this seriously at the time, you know, are behind the times. I mean, this is a current that really has caught on, and must be one of the reasons. I mean, I'll let you talk about the Claremont Institute and all its various incarnations and online. I mean, it's flabbergasting that people who were educated in this tradition, like Michael Anton, student of Harry Jaffa, would sponsor organs like Journal of American Greatness, or you should talk about this.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's still a lot of dots to connect sort of the Straussian stuff to the actual on the ground stuff happening now in the Claremont Institute. And so the Straussian world is very, you know, full of little factions and infighting, but the Claremont Institute represents what's called the West Coast Straussian School. And Leo Strauss was not especially fanatical about America, but he sort of liked America, and at least in his public presentations, you know, was a supporter of liberal democracy. Seemed like it was a good thing that he supported. But generally Straussians, they have a saying that modernity is built on low but solid ground, right? And the idea being that in the ancient world, everybody's seeking virtue and greatness, but in the modern world, with thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, they were trying to lower the temperature, maybe have some commerce and science, right? And these things would replace the religious wars, and we could just sort of live in peace on the basis of security and health, and not sort of set our aspirations so high. So that's sort of a typical Straussian line, low but solid ground with modernity. And the Claremont Institute doesn't really believe that, at least with respect to America. The Claremont School, the West Coast Straussians are more like, no, America is perfect. It's the perfect synthesis of antiquity and modernity. And it's super idealistic. It's the best possible regime, and it's high-minded, and it's virtue-seeking. It's kind of Republican, old school republicanism, virtue-seeking, and incredible. And so Harry Jaffa was a Lincoln scholar who wrote an amazing book about Lincoln and the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and worthwhile read. And he was really attached to the Declaration of Independence and kind of the moral core of Abraham Lincoln, and the fact that Abraham Lincoln saw clearly the moral necessities of America, and the fact that you had to have equality, and that was in conflict, that the Declaration was in conflict with slavery, and that Lincoln saw that and was able to kind of miraculously live out that truth in politics. So that's Jaffa, but then now it's this weird transformation of some of those ideas. But you can kind of see Jaffa also said that America was the best possible regime, and sort of that the creation of America was a kind of political miracle. And so what that sort of did, I think, is set up the people who follow him to think any fall away from that high ideal is a complete catastrophe, right? Any fall from the perfect principles of the Declaration which never really well, when were they instantiated at like after the Civil War? Not really, right? Like what's he but and they're the basically how it happens is that after the Civil Rights Act, like according to the Claremont School, not Harry Jaffa, but it's ever since 1964, right? That the fall has really been happening with the demographic change but I think that he set it up intellectually with, you know, if anything short of this ideal perfect living out the principles of the founding as laid out, you know, verbatim in the Constitution is a fall from grace, and so that's where Anton says, now anything we've departed so far from that anything is warranted, any actions are justified to get back. There's a kind of counter-revolutionary energy in how they think, right? Because anything short of the perfect ideal is warrants gives you carte blanche for whatever you want to do. And so that's what you keep seeing again and again in these Claremont circles is this counter-revolutionary back to first principles energy. They basically think we've fallen so far from those ideals now that we can do whatever we want. There's basically nothing to conserve. We need basically a total new founding. And furthermore, there's this, it's kind of been corrupted by paleoconservatism. So when I started writing, I was surprised by Michael Anton before he wrote the Flight 93 election. There's this, he and a few other people founded this thing called the Journal of American Greatness, which was an online blog where they started writing about a lot of this stuff. And they're quoting all these paleos. They're quoting Sam Francis. They're quoting Derbyshire, like some real racist for like leaders of the far right. And so that and he calls them. Anton says we're Paleo Straussians, which to Harry Jaffa's mind would have been like an insane oxymoron. So it's been corrupted by the demographic stuff and the nativism, in addition to already having this kind of latent extremism. So that's kind of what happened with it. That's maybe a nutshell of what's happened with the Claremont side.
Let me cite a passage from your book that I think it's an extremely well written and lucid book. But this passage stood out to me. It's about Curtis Yarvin, who at least 5 months ago was the darling of the MAGA universe, going on New York Times podcasts and profiled in the New Yorker, etc. But fashion, intellectual fashion is very fickle. But it's just Laura's lead into a discussion of Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin was involved in the early internet and beginning in the 2000s, took to blogging under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. The name of his original blog was Unqualified Reservations. Moldbug was prolific and gained an underground following in Silicon Valley, where he became a pioneer of nerdy, avant-garde, and right-wing bro speak. As an outsider, it is hard to understand how that was possible. Yarvin's writing is bad, and the reasoning is worse. Come for the edgelord conspiracism, stay for the non sequiturs, and slapdash pseudo-historical bricolage. They're making nothing on the new right more depressing than the rise of Curtis Yarvin. Such directness, willingness to call things by their names unflinchingly, and you went on, and which was justified. This is really refreshing, and the whole book is a breath of fresh air. But I mean, it almost feels like you have to kind of get down in the mud to talk about something. You call it the underbelly of the MAGA New Right, and you have this chapter on from the alt-right to the hard right. Maybe you could explain how that works a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I get pretty I was frustrated when I wrote that passage. I had to read some bad stuff for this book, and that was the worst. And I don't have a ton of patience for it, and it's partly just I'm not of that world, and Bronze Age pervert, like he's talking my language, which is a horrible thing to say if you've read him, because it's just like awful. But at least like yeah, right. Like it's really nasty. But there's something there that I'm like, I get this. I could see what he's doing, and I think it's funny sometimes, and I can see little glimpses of Nietzsche that are pretty neat. And But with Yarvin, I just get angry and I think this guy's such an idiot and I hate this. And it's unaccountable to truth, like in a really important way. It's just conspiracism and bullshit. And just like, and I just get so tired of it so quickly. And he goes on and on and on. And so I was frustrated when I wrote that. I was surprised by all the attention he's been getting. I continue to be surprised by the fact that he seems to have some clout in Silicon Valley, but I think that says a lot more about Silicon Valley than Curtis Yarvin. So I find it unreadable, but I think that he's clearly got a real knack for kind of angling in on something, for phrasing, for crafting phrases that capture something important, right? He had a phrase maybe a decade ago called "retire all government employees," RAGE, right? This acronym. I mean, that was pretty prescient and neat. The cathedral, he describes the sort of the Deneen calls it the liberalocracy. BAP calls it the longhouse. But there's the managerial elite. There are all these phrases to describe the regime, right? The liberal regime that controls everything and controls our minds. But the cathedral's pretty good, right? Because it captures this critique of the right that says that liberalism is a religion of its own, right? That it's shaping us in all kinds of ways that we can't know. And so there's something really clever about Yarvin that I mean you gotta concede, but I don't think he's not worth my spending a lot of time on because I don't have access to the Silicon Valley, like to whatever he's doing, it's not for me. And I think that maybe my sense is that he and Thiel are the only real sort of true believers of the tech bro world. They're not, maybe Andreessen too, in a way that the rest of them are kind of fickle, flaky opportunists. That it's far more about the money for them than the ideology in Silicon Valley. But I don't really know. It's just not kind of that's my sense of things. But what do you think?
Well, I agree with you. Interesting that you counterposed a couple of minutes ago, Alamariu, aka Bronze Age pervert, who actually was trained with Straussian.
Yeah.
At Yale, and Stephen Smith, and compared to Yarvin, who's full of who his art form, his rhetorical form is the blog, but he has coined these phrases that have caught on. I mean, is it an accident that RAGE, retire all government employees, from 2012 was realized in spring 2025? He also, this notion of this isn't innocent. Cathedral, I mean, he has this, saying that, you don't achieve a revolution by allowing the ideology of your opponent to stand intact. And he's urging some future ruler, this is about 6 years ago, whenever he says this, that the institutions of the cathedral, he's speaking above all of bastions of contemporary liberalism, the oligarchy, Harvard and similar schools, should be dismantled. This is the only way you can achieve your ends as a new ruler.
Yeah.
And I mean, lo and behold, this is what we've been witnessing for the last 6-7 months as well.
Yeah.
So, but you mentioned in part something else we have to. I mean, the tech fascism or tech bros, etc. You can't talk about any of this, and you just proved my supposition, without talking about Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
And he has his fingers in all kinds. Spoke at the 2016 Republican convention, and he really seems to be, to use a metaphor that might be commonplace in Silicon Valley speak, kind of the Darth Vader of so much of this, orchestrating what's going on. J.D. Vance, of the beginning of his career, to Peter Thiel. He funded Yarvin's startup, Thong, and the role he played in urging Trump and his handlers to place Vance on the ticket in 2024. Apparently was very decisive. And now I know where you want to start, but clearly he's he's gone off the deep end. I don't think, I will say that with all sobriety. With these lectures he's been giving on the Antichrist in San Francisco. And he began talking about the Antichrist already in 2008 when he was 2007 writing on René Girard, his teacher at Stanford, and Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss in the mix. But we can save that for last. This is the most recent incarnation, perhaps, of Peter Thiel. But there's some frightening ideas there. I just this claim that where American democracy permanently went down the tubes was in granting women the vote, and in the 1920s, and when women had gotten the vote, etc. And this kind of shows one what one is up against. So how would you describe his role? I mean, he's not an intellectual, but clearly he's been orchestrating quite a bit
Yeah.
of what's happening.
Yeah, it's the same. I have almost the same response as I do to Yarvin reading Thiel. I just find it very crazy making, and he's got this sort of semi-famous essay called The Straussian Moment, and that I learned of as I was writing the book, but that's from quite a bit earlier, right? And it's just full of the kind of things that he's kind of an autodidact. I don't want to say dilettante because maybe that's not, I don't want to sound like a total snob, but there's something about the way he writes where it's just like somebody who's obviously got a lot of money and a lot of clout who's making, who is not facing any pushback from serious people. And so he'll say things that have that are just not true, or that are completely unthought, thoughtless claims about the whole course of history. But it sounds, I think that it tells us a lot about how powerful just the wealth is to the people around him, right? Because he's been in these Straussian circles in California for decades now, sort of close to these Claremont people. They were having these reading groups on Strauss. I'll meet these Straussians and I'll say, so have you ever met Peter Thiel? And they're like, oh yeah, of course. I met him at a reading group at the Claremont Institute 20 years ago. And so he's just in sort of in these conspiratorial, the kind of dark world of Straussian esotericism for a very long time. And that's how his mind is shaped. Plus all the weird Girard stuff, which I just haven't had honestly had time to really delve into. But so it's I think just so it's so interesting how somebody like that, who has this weird background and these weird eclectic interests, then sort of swoops into these circles and has all this authority based on the sophistication, right? But he doesn't, I think he wouldn't, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure he could earn a PhD, but like something about the discipline of academia is just totally absent from his thinking. And that it's really frustrating, but I think that's true of all of Silicon Valley so far.
He does appear to be making some intellectual progress, though, with his lectures on the Antichrist, because he's narrowed down the most likely. You never know what guise the Antichrist will emerge in.
AI, right? Oh no,
No, he was in favor of that,
Greta.
but he's narrowed down to either Bernie Sanders or Greta Thunberg, who might be the same person after all. So you have to kind of look at them closely to see what's going on here. So it's a lot of food for thought, I guess. But this is someone, you're right, who's one of the reasons Vance was selected is because his links to Silicon Valley and Peter Thiel and fundraising possibilities for Trump. Trump is very, dollars and cents oriented, isn't he? So one thing, and see, Peter Thiel comes up again, but another significant organization that Peter Thiel has helped fund in the last 6 years are these NatCon conferences. And you talk a little bit about the American educated Israeli scholar Yoram Hazony and his working on these conferences, which have been the mandatory platforms for developing the kinds of America First concerns and ethnic nationalism orientation. And it's been coupled with it's quite alarming, a denial of equal citizenship. And as you intimated a few minutes ago, a denial of what was sacred for someone like Harry Jaffa, the Declaration of Independence and the basis of the natural rights republic, which you can reconcile somehow with Straussianism, right? And
Yeah.
Strauss's endorsement of natural rights, which was what was great about the Greeks. This is a very disturbing term and it fits with the anti-immigrant and
Yeah,
a notion of some kind of tiered citizenship. And Vance has been pushing this line too.
Yeah.
Legacy citizens are worth a lot more than those who are supposedly equal than naturalized citizens.
yeah, I mean, that's sort of one of the most surprising things that's happened, or just the most obviously disappointing things is I think at least in the Straussian world I was familiar with, there's sort of this love of the idea of creedal America, this Tocquevillian idea. It's also just an American idea, right? That America is about an idea, right? And about people coming together from all over the world, and that it's not about a particular nationality or ethnicity. It's about this belief in America and equality and freedom. And they've really turned their back on that explicitly throughout the movement. Sort of one by one, you'll have people like Chris DeMuth doing that early on, who used to be the president of the AEI, sort of getting on board with nationalism, saying I'm no longer a sort of declarationist believer in the creedal America. And it's just all the way down the list. And so I think that's extremely disheartening. I think that the GOP is, I don't think that, and I also think that's really a radical departure from what the average voter feels about the country and how they think about the country. I think that Americans tend to be quite attached to the idea of the creedal nation and, the Statue of Liberty and these sort of symbols. So I don't think that's going to be good for them in the long term. I don't think JD Vance is taking that turn is a smart move, but I think that it's a sort of sincere move on their part. I think they really think that they're saving Western civilization, right? And there's this sort of radical ideology fueling those ideas.
Does this line up with the notion of the quest for a red Caesar that you discuss later in the book in relation to Michael Anton? This is, and when I read this section of the book a couple months ago, I went online in all innocence, and you see all these, you do it right now, images of Trump and Elon Musk, for that matter, dressed up in Roman garb as new Caesars. And some of these are selling as tokens on the internet for hundreds of dollars. Yeah, hundreds of dollars. I don't know who's buying them. Probably not a lot of people in Manhattan. But this. I mean, it sounds like it's gibberish, but there's a logic to it. The salvation, I mean, it fits in with philosopher kings in part, but also the need for Caesarism it's a frightening passage in this book by Anne to resolve a possible civil war between red and blue states. How are we going to settle these matters, avoid a civil?
And I mean, he basically
red
said,
Caesar's better than these.
sort of, if you think about the people who are sort of the smartest people I write about, they basically think we're already at that point in history where there's obviously no more constitution, there's no more Republican virtue. It's a total decadence, and the Constitution's totally unraveled. And I mean, look at Congress; they're doing nothing, right? So I mean, that's because they're Republicans, I guess. But it's like you could see, and the growth of the administrative state. You've got someone like Adrian Vermeule who is just basically is arguing that the executive authority is all there really is left, and so all of these things sort of fit together to say, well, we're at the point where we just have the presidential power anyway. We've already lost the kind of checks and balances and the constitutional system as it was intended. So the question really is it going to be a blue Caesar or a red Caesar? We obviously want to get the red Caesar, keep him in power. Like that's how they talk. That's how Anton writes about this. So I think I don't know maybe we'll leave it at that and have questions, or how are we doing on time here?
Sure.
Do you
One we're
Yeah.
doing fine.
Okay.
But one tweak to
Yeah.
your answer about the Red Caesar, I mean, the discussion you have later in the book about the role of the Claremont Institute and Anton and other Claremont Institute oligarchs in spreading the election denial myth.
Mhm.
Already in September,
Mhm.
they're prophesying that there's a attempt by Biden and company to steal the election. They're laying the groundwork for that. And then, of course, after January 6th,
Yeah.
their reconstruction, reconceptualization of what that meant.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's the really, I mean, it's easy to sound conspiratorial about all this stuff, but at this point, I think we'd be fools not to be thinking about what could happen because they tried to steal the 2020 election. They tried months before the election to set the groundwork intellectually for the fact that there was going to be this stolen election. I mean, a lot of people were worried about the 2020 election and were gaming out, problems that could arise or whatever. And so were they, but they started saying it was stolen before it even happened. And so, I mean, and then January 6th happened. I mean, it's like I think that people need to be thinking about protecting the elections, and I think they are. But I mean, I think it's a real concern. What will they be doing in midterms? What will they be doing in 2020? It's a live concern. Obviously, but you do sort of sound crazy saying that they're going to try to steal the upcoming.
I feel, I mean, it's a wonderful book, and I feel it's great listening to you give us the background and how you approach this. I feel we just kind of scratched the surface, but let's. I'm sure there's some questions that from audience curiosity. John.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks for putting this together, Rick and Eli, and thank you, Laura. Sorry. But I guess maybe I didn't read the flyer very closely. And I thought this was, and maybe because I'm a sociology professor by training, that this would have more to do with the social organization of the MAGA base and who they are and who's voting for them and why are they unhappy and supporting Trump and that sort of thing. So I guess in a way, the question is, how do we get from, Plato and Strauss, Michael Anton to Donald Trump, right? Because when I think of the MAGA movement, I think immediately of him. And this is, rather esoteric, most of this stuff. I mean, most people aren't reading it, and Trump, I'm sure, has never heard of many of the people that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
And certainly doesn't read anything. So I'm just curious, if you could say a little bit more about how we get from, the intellectual foundations, insofar as that's the way to characterize it, to what Trump is doing. I mean, I remember hearing a story about when Trump was a real estate mogul, nearly a real estate mogul, that he would show up at his office in the morning with no plan whatsoever about what was going to be done that day. He would just sit down at a table and say, "Okay, what are we going to do today?"
Yeah.
And so it's hard to imagine, an intellectual foundation for somebody who shoots from the hip.
Yeah, totally.
All the time.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's sort of the $1 million question. And I think my answer is that in 2016, they were sort of playing catch up and sort of nature abhors a vacuum. So they were backfilling he came up and he presented an opportunity to these intellectuals. And that's always going to happen with people in power, no matter their character or their tendencies, right? And so but they recognized that he represented something that they actually cared about and that actually had like deep roots in American conservatism, right? With all of this, the nativism, the paleocon stuff, the isolationism, like all of these things. Like Trump had an instinct for all that stuff, and they just were like, "Oh, that's our guy. Like this is our guy." And so then they started then other people got excited about it and joined in the movement, right? And so they kind of started to collaborate and get together and sort of build this intellectual infrastructure that was basically backfilling what he wanted to do. I mean, and he didn't take much out. He didn't really care much about that during the first administration. And then they were doing all this stuff during Biden to kind of test it and work on it. Biden even, took some of their ideas with the infrastructure bills, the reindustrialization stuff. That was sometimes from these guys. And so by the time Trump 2.0 comes around, they are driving the agenda. Not in any direct way with Trump, but with Vance and then with Doge and just a lot of the stuff that's happening. I think it's fair to say they were causing a lot of that. Not the people I write about aren't really the policy guys, they're the culture guys, they're sort of the philosopher guys. But I think that just sort of the broad strokes that they're the guys sort of telling Russ Vought what to do, or educating Vought and educating the staffers and kind of supplying the staff and the kind of the ideology at a certain point. So, but Trump, I think what he does, he gives cover to that. It's almost like it took us to 8 years to see what was happening because he's so he doesn't care. And so nobody believes that this is even happening or possible because it's like, it just seems unbelievable that there's this sort of intellectual world growing up next to him because pretty much independently of him, he's basically camouflaging it is sort of how I think about it. And it doesn't mean, I also think it's like, it's one slice that's important and an unimportant driver, but there's a MAGA is, as you know, if you're like it's way bigger than that. There's just all this different stuff happening. There's the Christian right, which is sort of adjacent and part of the world I write about, but there's also like this whole other Trumpy part of like the independent charismatic movement, and sort of like there's a whole revivalist movement happening that's part of MAGA or adjacent, connected with MAGA. So there's so much going on, but I think this is an important driver and does give it has a lot of explanatory power for the differences between 2.0 and 1.0.
Eli?
Thank you. It was a fantastic talk. And as I said before, the book was it's really wonderful. A few comments and a question. I should I'll keep it really brief. One is I think you've alluded to it today and certainly in the book, but I think it bears some stressing the fact that there's a real sectarianism there. They're not all in line. They're not all on the same page. For example, I've had conversations with some of these folks, so kind of online and offline, and BAP and his people hate the Christian right, hate the Christian nationalists. They see themselves as pagans. Hazoni, for example, really has a huge problem with BAP, and I had a Zoom meeting with him where he was just like picking my brain about what is it about BAP that people are so fascinated about. Bronze Age pervert, his version of Nietzsche. So I think that really it's worth kind of thinking through just this kind of sectarianism that's going on even within the MAGA movement. Something about Strauss's theological political problem, or this kind of reason and revelation. My reading of Strauss is that even his Plato is like a Nietzschean Plato. It's like infused with Nietzsche's critique of Plato, and Nietzsche's critique of Plato's will to truth, and a kind of substitution of the will to power principle. So Strauss and many of his disciples read Plato through a kind of Nietzschean lens, where power becomes this kind of key philosophical principle, not just political principle, where power kind of is something higher than truth, which there's even a kind of postmodern dynamic, I think, in Straussian thought about truth. Is there even truth? And power becomes something that's kind of, I think, higher than truth. Also, I read Strauss, and I think many do, as an atheist, and yet he makes a lot about the suprahuman or supra-rational sources of wisdom. And I think there's also this kind of Nietzschean notion of the philosophers, not only as kings, but as meaning makers, as truth makers, as kind of, having godlike powers. If there is no God and we need a God, then the philosophers have to become the gods that the rest of us need. And then one thing about regime cycles, I think in a lot of their thinking, and it's certainly there in Strauss, there isn't one kind of fixed and kind of permanent ideological truth. There's a kind of the philosophers and their ideas kind of moving regimes. And when regimes grow stale and bad, they need to be moved again. There's a kind of, I see Polybius there and I see Machiavelli there. And even with the Caesarism, he talks about constitutional regimes and post-constitutional regimes and the Caesarism. And then after Caesarism, there's a pre-constitutional order and then another constitutional order. So there's this kind of movement of regimes that I think is very much there in Strauss. And one final, this is the question. You mentioned the sophists. One character that I don't think you mentioned in your book, and I wonder if you maybe say a word about him, is Thrasymachus, because he's kind of all important in book one of the Republic, and I think Plato had said that the Republic was going to be called Thrasymachus.
Oh, really?
I believe so, although I could be corrected by those who know.
And well, I'll just think that might have been a separate dialogue, its own independent dialogue that then became the first book of the Republic.
But Strauss makes a lot about what he calls the way of Socrates and the way of Thrasymachus. And I think there's something, and I need to think through this a lot more, where he can be a kind of Thrasymacheian hiding as a Socratic. And I think there's something about the teaching of that you can't know justice unless you have justice in your soul. And a Thrasymacheian can never understand justice in the way that a Socratic philosopher can understand justice because of the nature of his soul. And I think that speaks to maybe a lot of the thinkers that you were writing about. No, I wonder if you say
Straussian in the room. I mean, yeah. I mean, you I think are more in the with Strauss. None of what you say is shocking to me. I love the postmodern Plato stuff. I am sympathetic to that. I think though the problem is that it's how you understand Nietzsche and how you understand what power and the relationship between power and truth, and whether you think that just because truth is in power involves truth, or like the manipulation of truth, even not the manipulation of truth, but like how does truth become empowered in the world? How does truth manifest in the world? I don't think Nietzsche's just like an anything goes kind of guy. I think he cares a lot about truth, but it's not platonic truth as an out there truth. It's like truth as it is in our world. Truth as in like, who stole the election? Well, was the election stolen or not? We can have access to that. It's a real thing in the world that we can learn and investigate. And there's things that like world truth. So, I mean, it just gets super heady pretty fast. But I think that those questions, I think that just because there's maybe a postmodern way to understand Plato, and that Plato wasn't necessarily quite the idealist philosopher that many read him as, does not mean that he's a will to power, like you can just go shoot people to instantiate your truth and become Bronze Age pervert. I mean, that's I think what the BAP people are doing, and that's how they understand it. And I think it's ridiculous. And I think it's ridiculous because of the difference between Thrasymachus and Socrates, and what Socrates has in his soul, and what he's able to show Thrasymachus in his own soul in the Republic, right? And so these things matter. I don't think so. Anyway, maybe we won't go on about, but that's my answer to you. Yeah. Yes.
It's a completely different kind of question. One of the big surprises of 2025 is the degree to which justices of the Supreme Court have allowed many of these strange ideas actually go through. And does your book at all talk about the relationship between any of these ideas and the 9 people who are in the Supreme Court and how to relate to these ideas?
Only indirectly, because I talk a lot about Adrian Vermeule, who's kind of the constitutional scholar of the new right, and as a conservative Catholic, a lot of people talk about there, 6 of these justices are Catholic conservatives. And I'm a little bit probably not very hawkish on that question. I think that there's still a very big difference between the justices on the Supreme Courts and their Catholicism versus what Adrian Vermeule is doing, and how I think they're sort of more wedded to the old originalist jurisprudence, which Adrian Dermule is trying to destroy. And so that's with the exception of two of them. So I just don't, I think that there's a story you can tell that there's been a takeover of the Supreme Court by the people I write about, and that they're all in cahoots or whatever, and Opus Dei or whatever. And that's not what I think, but I'll just say that I think so. I'm a little bit maybe Pollyanna about it, and I don't really. I just don't know how to read I think they're in a very difficult position because they're trying to not have a major constitutional crisis, which they will not be able to fix, or they don't have the power. So that's my read on that.
What I'm specifically referring to is
Mhm.
that there seems to be an obvious conflict between concept of originalism on the
Yeah.
one hand
Yeah,
and the concept of the unitary executive,
Yeah.
which we're told that several of the justices, because they came up in the Reagan administration,
yeah,
believe in the unitary
Yeah.
executive. Clearly, the one thing the Constitution
Yeah.
is not looking for with the unitary executive.
yeah, no. And I think there is this guy, Adrian Vermeule, who's basically squaring that circle, and who's written a lot about the executive and the administrative state, and just like in glowing terms, basically like it's fine, don't worry about that. That's his whole, like, that's his, and then now he's writing about common good constitutionalism with this, which is effectively, though it's not written this way, a Catholic replacement to originalism. And not just Catholic, like the Pope would not approve, right? So it's very, but I don't think that that's taken over the kind of conservative legal movement. I think, but it has a lot of power on the ground, I think, with young people, the Vermeers. Yes.
So you went to grad school not to do politics, and I of course did.
Yes.
So I'm thinking this very much in terms of these guys are winning because the Republican Party is letting them win. That Paul Ryan's letting them
Yeah.
win, that John Thune, that Mike Johnson, that these people raised in the Reagan administration, raised in the Reagan school, are looking at this stuff and saying, this is fine. Which I think is my explanation for John Roberts is a really good Republican. Including when he goes against him. So why does the average Republican politician okay with these people?
I mean, my sense is that a lot of what's happened is that Trump won in 2016. That was a shocking thing to a lot of the people, right? The real politicians, and it still is, I think. But they are in a bind because he has so much power in the party, especially now. And so, I used to be really disgusted by all the people who would on the Republican side who would just go along and keep their jobs and play within the game, But now I'm like, I'm glad. Now it's like, oh, they really are in a difficult position. But I mean, I still think it's a bit of. So I don't really know, except for I even think it just is normalizing when you have him as president. It's normalizing, and so that's I don't think it was. I don't think he's got this new like robust multiracial coalition. It's that average voters see him in power, the world didn't fall apart, and so they're just like, oh, he's fine, and he's better, and there was not much going on the other side, and so it's this kind of just years and years of normalization, and now I think the cracks are starting to show. I think it's still maybe a bit of a house of cards, but it's pretty, who knows? I don't know, Brian, this is Brian Arbor, he's a real political expert, so also.
Yeah, I mean,
But do you have a thought?
some of this is just so sort of polarization means the parties can do whatever they want because there's so little give in the middle.
Yeah.
And part of it is that, as you said, I mean, talk about sort of Republican virtue, and the place where I see that the least is in neutral media.
Yeah.
Because the only thing we care about is who wins. That's
Yeah.
the only bit of morality
Yeah.
we can sort of establish anything. So we'll never sort of ask a question about whether it's good or bad for democracy. But that leads to, again, this constant sort of re-upping. And again, Trump's been in charge of that party for 9 years. The share of politicians who existed before that, came up before that, is exceeding is small. Yeah, and most of that's just natural. This happened over 9 years. It's slow, but it does happen. But some of it is, I think like Vance with it. I had to read it. I had to read it to write my. I had to read his book to write my book. What's sort of notable to me, read this in 2024 is like there is no racism. There was no Trump, there was nothing about immigration, and here it looks like this looks like he's explaining red tape in his sort of successors, and clearly he's chosen something vastly different than I think what goes into what sort of he wrote. I assume that's entirely ambition.
I think it's more ideological.
Yeah.
Right, you know,
At some level, it
but-
does matter
yeah,
because
yeah,
he's win,
Yeah.
he succeeded. He's the single most likely person to be president in 2020.
I don't know if I agree with that. Yes,
This may have nothing to do with your book, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the attraction to young men, in particular to MAGA and that would seem the best.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah. The book, I mean, it seems to me that there is, I mean, we hear a lot about the crisis of masculinity, the kind of feminization of the workplace in Rostov. That's, you know, mine, and I guess the kind of, so some of that's just maybe reactionary misogyny or the sort of, but I think there's something deeper happening where my go-to sort of explanation for this is Jordan Peterson, right? You've got Jordan Peterson, this wacky Canadian psychologist, writes this book about the 12 rules for life that becomes an absolute like bestseller around the world. And so there's obviously this enormous clamoring for meaning and guidance, right? For some sort of authority and like how to live among young men. Like it's just palpable and that's real. And the rest of us have very little to say to it. And so in the book, I try to just sort of like get at this in various sideways ways when I'm talking about higher ed and my own experiences in school, because I think that sort of genuine liberal arts education and humanities education, if we had that, people would not be falling for Jordan Peterson's garbage. And so that it is my view, right? And it's not but that's not really it. And there is a lot of that in our universities. I don't mean to say that the universities are all failing. I don't think that's it either, but they're not sort of robustly taking this charge in hand to educate the youth and do meaning of life and Socratic education and read great books and do comparative literature and that's not happening, I don't think, but I mean and I think it needs to. And so that's I think liberalism there, if you're a political theorist who reads about Rawls and reads people who write about Rawls and understand the last sort of 50 years of political science and liberalism, liberals have sort of been, I guess you could almost say, asleep at the wheel, right? And taking a lot for granted and taking a lot philosophically for granted. And so there hasn't even been any kind of robust, I think, defense of liberal democracy in the academy, let alone sort of a robust humanism. So I think there are big problems there that I would point to. And it's sort of it's understandable that people take things for granted, but at a certain point professors across the country have to also like admit this and do something about it. Or the stupid boards that run the university. I don't know how it works, but that's my answer. Yes.
How does violence play?
I mean, I guess it's like they're priming the ground culturally for violence with their rhetoric, their dehumanizing rhetoric. I mean, there's like a whole gradation of characters in my books, right? In my book, right? Of like highbrow constitutional Harvard scholars who don't get very violent in their rhetoric, but get very extreme in their defense of certain kinds of ideas. And then there's just like these gutter people who are like, when you read Bronze Age Pervert, it is violent language. It's like, we will burn it all down. The bug men will be destroyed. It's brutal. And a lot of it's really racist, really hateful. So, I mean, it's just this kind of generative, like constant priming the world for violence, is my view of it. And what's happened is the Republicans, who are sort of respectable, have done nothing until now, the Nick Fuentes Carlson thing, you have like a few little mini meltdowns over the anti-Semitism, as there should be. I mean, it's really gross stuff that Fuentes says, but it's like, come on, this has been going on for a whole decade. Trump is one of the worst offenders. So that's, I think, what's happening.
Do you want to talk for a second about the way internet culture is a vehicle of radicalization, dissemination of execrable ideas that could find no reputable publisher, but
Yeah.
this has been researched, and it's obviously plays a big role. And if you're kind of trained like I am, and it seems like you are, in classic texts and the canon, etc. This is, I mean, you deal with Bronze Age pervert, etc. But this is an entirely different world, and a world that's absolutely impervious to any kind of modification or mollification through reason of any sort. They've shown the algorithms on YouTube. It's a self-radicalizing process. You click here, and it's going to give you a more radical because this is what keeps people tuned in and clicking. And we're dealing with an entirely different cultural world that is, not unchaperoned, as it were.
I don't have anything more. I mean, that's a good, I think, enough, yeah, description of what's happening. Yes.
Patrick?
Not to bring us back to Peter Thiel, but when I look at your graph,
Yeah.
he's in each one of those. He either funds or participates in the ideas. And I've been spending time in the Internet Archive on these early blogs, and I guess just to ask you a question in particular about the role of libertarianism in these thinkers' ideas, and to your point, in the internet and in what the internet fosters. Yarvin's first post as Mencius Moldbug is on this blog called Two Blowhards, and it's for like hobbyists or something. But then you go into the other sites they link to, and you find John Derbyshire and Steve Saylor and evolutionary psychology.
Was he linked to it?
Yeah, they linked to all these guys' blogs. But then Yarvin's page, they ask him for reading recommendations at the end, because I guess he would comment on this site a lot. And what he recommends are Albert J. Nock and James Burnham. And just a little note, but Yarvin's computer program, one of the nodes that he creates for his weird notion of how the internet would work is called Nock. I don't know, just sort of a interesting coincidence. But I guess there's this idea with the internet of the libertarian to authoritarian pipeline.
Right.
And sort of libertarianism seems to always sort of be there as a justification for an idea that gets you further into this sort of reactionary.
Yeah.
I mean, futurism in a way because of Silicon Valley. So sort of a question.
Yeah, I mean that it's the libertarian, I think that all sounds right. And the libertarian movement, as I understand it, has always had these like different sort of cohorts and parts to it. And so some of them go to like James Burnham, like pretty deeply thoughtful and sort of like spoken a lot of these ways, but sort of as a warning and not as I understand it. So now, I mean, I just, it goes in all these weird directions, like Murray Rothbard, like there's all these weird characters in the libertarian movement. And then the party itself, I mean, what we've seen, I think, during Trumpism is like one sort of slice of it's gone all in with MAGA. And there are a few offshoots who have been like some of the best defenders of liberty, right? With these, Shika Damia, my friend, Radley Balco, these like, the Cato Institute's been pretty good. So it's like really messy. And I don't think I understand really the new right reaction, the reactionary world well enough. I just haven't had time to really hack that. So I would like to see those blogs.
I have one other
There's a great book though, When the Clock Broke, to kind of get
something else I was wondering about is sort of, you said Thiel has sort of been immersed in this Straussian esotericism, and then he funds Yarvin, who you referred to as being very good at, the thing he's good at is creating catchy phrases.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering where you see esotericism, I think, in our current internet age.
Well, like, is esotericism possible? Is that the
Or
question?
is it like being accelerated by?
I don't, yeah, maybe, I mean, I guess there's probably, I mean, I assume, does Yarvin think in those terms to you? You sound like you know a lot. about Yarvin.
He doesn't really.
No, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of wink, wink, nudge, nudge in all kinds of ways, but it's not exactly like esotericism in the form of like you need to unpack things carefully. It's like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We're fascists, right? So it's not quite subtle enough. I mean, but it is. That's what it is. This Richard Hanania guy, if you follow him, he was a white supremacist like poster for a while, and then now he's kind of rehabilitating himself. But he's got a great post where he kind of explains the cultural dynamics of some of this. I can't remember the title of the post, but if you go looking on his Substack, like there's just the culture part of it, the LARPing part of it, the online sort of transgression stuff. It's really worrisome and violent, but it's also really preposterous and silly. And so there's probably just a lot of different things going.
Yeah, Laura, so the book's amazing, in my opinion. You're so good on the right, conservative sources, philosophical sources of all of this, from Schmidt to Strauss to Stephen Pink, for the integralists and all of that. But one thing, there was a story the other day in the Times, the lead story. It was about the Minnesota welfare case with the Somalis, which was a big, big story. The person who generated that, I didn't know this, was Chris Rufo.
Mm-hmm.
And I find him to be the most formidable of all of these people. He's kind of like a less bombastic Steve Bannon in a sense. But the reason I thought of the book is that numerous times over the years, Bannon has called himself a Leninist. And there's a couple of places in the book where you refer to the influence of Gramsci on political culture, on some of these folks. And I guess my question is, and I know that Rufo comes out of kind of a left-wing background originally, and he was turned down. I think his parents or whatever. I can't remember the details. I remember reading a bio of him, or like a profile of him a while back. Do any of these people take Lenin seriously? Because a lot of what they do, I mean, I come straight out of what is to be done, and they gesture towards, like a few of them gesture towards it. I don't know if they take it seriously at all. I'm just curious if you ever came across any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rufo thinks he takes it seriously, and they think, and I'm educated as a Straussian who hasn't read much of Lenin, right, or Marx. Like I've done my little due diligence, but I went to this. So Rufo, I think in his book has quite a bit about that, and that's like his whole framing. And the story is that the left has seized the institutions, has controls culture, and it's all been done by elites, right? And Claremonters talk this way and have been for a long time. That but it goes back to like what's Charles Beard, the historian? Like they attack these thinkers as being basically having corrupted all of culture, including all Black thinkers, right? Like it's like all critical thought. It's these intellectuals sort of drumming up these injustices in the world to then combat. And so their story is that the intellectuals have corrupted the universities, and then that's corrupted the culture and so forth. And that's it's a Leninist takeover. And so that's what justifies the counter-revolution. And in Rufo's mind, that's the story he's telling, but it's completely detached from the real injustices that inspired those scholars to do their work. And all of the rest of it. So I think they do take it seriously in a way, but it's also just kind of makes a mockery of the actual thought on the left. No, I don't care about Lenin, but
yeah, that's more about tactics.
Yeah, but tactically, I think they do take it seriously, and I think they've gone about as far as they can in winning with that theory than they're likely to. I mean, at some point, reality also is going to hit them in the face, right? I think. Maybe you can't, it's so much of it is just not true that they're saying. So I think that the extent to which the culture war can completely control things, and that's a real question.
In the book you call
I remember Sam Francis, sort of an inverted Marxist.
Mm,
And of course, there's this, I mean, people call Leninism, a form of fascism. There's this authoritarianism that, wells up in the 1920s, both right and left, and there's national. I mean, the proximity is, not in a way not so different. It's Machiavellian. There are
yeah.
books on. I mean, Burnham was a Machiavellian, I think, because he's totally cynical about norms and democracy and liberalism. So powers that it's an old argument by Italian social theorists that Pareto, Mosca, that power is all there is.
Yeah.
So and I think the Straussians, once they get away from the ethereal realm of the forms, and you're down in the changeable sphere of reality, and instantiated forms where anything goes on. I think this is a license for naked power. I think this is the way they think in part.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I was trying to think through how to explain J.D. Vance's current mentality, and I think that it does have to do like this and the Straussian stuff with the power and sort of raw power and the role of ideas. And I think that there's something that the sort of Straussian education and this idea of the sort of the secret Nietzschean Straussians, right? Which I really think it's there, but I think that it's really sort of cheapened, right, when we're talking like this. But there's certainly, and this is where I would blame the East Coast Straussians, right? That there's a real kind of in some of these circles, there's a real disdain for ordinary politics, and it's just basically the idea is real, unlike like Alan Bloom, right? Unlike the world of philosophy, which is the meaning of life. Once you get your hands in politics, it's a dirty business, and that's just the way it is. And so, if you're going to do that, you're already you're selling your hands. It's a dirty business, and yeah, anything goes because of that. And I think there's something really sick and nihilistic about that. I think it's a really dangerous way of understanding politics, and it's very pervasive in the Straussian world. So I think that, and once you get sort of drawn into that, and I can remember sitting there with Straussian watching the invasion of Iraq, right? And it was just, there's something really twisted about it because it's you no longer are thinking about the humanity of people, right? It's not because you think they're animals, nothing like that. It's just because that's what politics is. And that's, and I think there's something really, really dangerous about that. But my own view is that postmodernism does not, maybe the irresponsible postmodernists do have this very cynical view of power, but I don't think Nietzsche does, and I don't think that, I think there's a healthy way through this that understands that ideas can have power and can exert power, but they can still be humane, your work, if you're gonna dirty your hands in the world of political philosophy, sort of active, you can ameliorate things, you can be humane, you can be a philosopher king who isn't a total cynic. So, and I think that's where I would go with Plato, but that's not exactly exciting stuff for the young men.
Let's see. Yeah, right. There are too many. Yeah. Okay. So, well, why don't we take one more question? We were going to end. Seven. Yes, in the back.
Well, see, just now you said that you feel like reality is going to hit these people in the face, and earlier you were talking about, J.D. Vance talking about tiered citizenship and this idea that like that's not something that really will appeal the average voter. I'm just curious if any sort of on this chart, like any of these people or any of these ideas, do you feel that they will ever achieve like a certain level, like genuine popular salience, or will they just like remain like an elite level thing?
I guess part of what I think, if we're doing that kind of heady conversation about how ideas work in culture, I think that the public, can be very fickle, and and there's a kind of, I think propaganda can be really powerful for time, and so, yeah, I think this I don't know, I still think I think America is a very big, vast country with all kinds of like factional interests that will counter some of this, and are every day people in the streets are countering this and hate it. And there are, and there might be a breaking point for a lot of these politicians. On the other hand, they have the power of the institutions right now. They have the president, so I think, and so I think there's a limit to how much of the sort of cultural stuff, how far they can go, but I don't want to be like naive about that. I think terrible. I keep being surprised again and again about how terrible things
How
are.
about replacement theory?
Right.
Is that an illustration of the way one of these?
Well, there's
right-wing myths
still
can-
the streets, right, in mass. So I think it's bad enough. Like I don't mean to. I think your question is an important one, and I don't mean to sound like I think it's just going to fall apart or that it's weak. It's not weak. It's terrible. And so, so that's my I think they can do a lot worse too.
Okay. On that, I think we've, thanks for the interesting question. I think we've managed to exhaust Laura, the moderator, but it was a great evening. Thanks so much again for doing this.